Hola y bienvenidos al podcast Un gato en tierra de perros, vuestra referencia para la política estadounidense, la cultura y mucho más. Hello, I'm Joe Magaha. Thank you, friends, for being with me for another episode of Un Gato en Tierra de Perros. This episode will be dedicated once again to U.S. conflicts around the world. We have with us, once again, Mr. Brooks Crenshaw. Welcome, Brooks.
Hey, Joe. Good to be with you.
Same here, for sure. And we have again Mr. Amir Taaki. Welcome, Amir.
Yeah, good. A pleasure.
Absolutely. I was saying to Brooks earlier that I thought maybe we'd be a little further along in the peace talks by now. We're at a little over 100 days of Trump's presidency. I know that he did sign an agreement about raw earth this week with Zelensky or with the Ukrainians. But it still seems to be kind of creeping slowly towards peace. Do you guys think that that we'll see something within the next maybe 30 to 60 days, or you think it's going to be a much more extended conflict? Either one.
I'm not happy with the current state with regard to the ceasefire. I mean, obviously, Putin proposed a 3-day, which was really just a commemoration of the Russian victory in World War II. Zelensky called it theater. Ukraine wants a 30-day ceasefire. Putin views that in the way that one might have viewed Yasser Arafat's peace talks back in the day, as an opportunity to rearm. So, we're in kind of a quandary. I know that Trump winning the election signals the idea that we want to make a good deal and end the conflict. I think we should be talking about Ukraine and NATO as a non-starter for the foreseeable. But yeah, things are still in a bit of limbo right now. I don't know if Putin is going to come to the table in the next month or not.
Yeah, it's kind of, it seems like the Europeans have been flailing their arms a lot and bashing their chests, acting like they're going to handle everything, which they're not. They don't have the means to do so. But I think it's a nice distraction for a lot of European countries to be like, well, we're with Ukraine 100%, and if the United States abandons them, we won't. Of course, there are all kinds of financial problems throughout Europe. There was a big blackout in Spain and Portugal and part of South France this past week, which freaked a lot of people out for a lot of reasons. And I don't think it's been 100% explained. Some people thought it might have been hacking of some kind. Amir, in the last episode that we talked, you discussed AI and how everyone's kind of rushing and ramping up AI for warfare. And I was mentioning to Brooks also, last month there was a Palestinian protester who shouted at the CEO of Microsoft, and then just this past week there was a Palestinian protester who shouted at the head of Palantir about how AI is killing Palestinians. It seems AI is the future of warfare. Is it? Are they accurate that it's already being implemented to the point where it's the main source of the destruction of the people in Gaza?
I haven't been following Gaza in particular, but so a lot of AI, basically these are all information systems, and they're ingesting a lot of information, and AI systems basically allow you to automate a lot of that processing of information. The biggest one is drone warfare, where drones are extremely cheap and you can just fill the sky with them. They're basically like a mobile surveillance platform. And if you, and as much as you automate their operation, then you basically have a very low cost, swarm weapons system that is able to very quickly take decisions and act without necessarily needing a lot of human intermediation. And I know in Ukraine they've actually been using unmanned boats to target Russian assets. So a lot of that is, and obviously Palantir, made by Peter Thiel, has very, I think Peter Thiel, in his worldview, he basically sees that there's this conflict between like the Christian West and Islam, and so Palantir is, he is like his project, which they want to use like AI automated weapons as much as possible for those US conflicts. I do think, AI, or information systems in general, they're like very important for warfare, and drones as well.
Yeah, I was mentioning Jose Andres because I follow him on X, and I like what he does in terms of being an ambassador for Spanish food and Spanish culture, and also for helping people in disasters. But he also seems to be a bit of a CIA asset. And I think it was maybe 2 years ago, he was on X begging Elon Musk to turn on Starlink so that the Ukrainians could pinpoint where the Russian troops were to kill them. And I'm wondering what a chef has to do with that. But it is what it is. Everybody seems to be so many prominent people in the media seem to be connected to intelligence in some way or another. Brooks, do you have a take on that? Do you?
Well, yeah, it's a remnant of the post-war. So, like I've said this on multiple appearances that when I was deployed for 6-8 months in Southwest Anbar, right, I had to gin up, and take relief from the previous team. I had to get things started. I had to work on my own targeting deck, and we had to get busy with regard to asymmetrical operations, mostly direct action. That said, the domestic types never have to ramp up and rep down. They speak the language. They go home 20 minutes away. They wake up. They own the streets. There's no major threat. So, like, those networks mature to a point where the overlap becomes indistinguishable one from the other. So, media, industrial intelligence, like this is kind of Mike Benz's The Blob with regard to the creeping of bureaus into the same overlap and industry that comes to meet them in the middle. So, it is at this point difficult to tease out some certain corporate from government from, it's that public-private partnership language, which, had you mentioned this in the 40s, we would have all kind of known what to call it, but now we're not really sure because it's just what it is. So yeah, there's just this blob of mutual interest, and a chef with agency ties is certainly not surprising given the access and placement that someone like him can access without much without much suspicion. So it surprises me very little to find out that anybody is involved in intelligence gathering or intelligence exploitation.
Yeah, I that was probably my main concern when during the election with JD Vance was his connection to Peter Thiel. He I believe Peter Thiel financed JD Vance's company and really pulled him out of obscurity. And that's great. But then does that mean they share the same?
Well, so Vance is a former Marine. He kind of came from nothing. Like he came from Appalachia, which is not far from where I currently am. So he's a major success story with regard to the American dream. But Thiel is an enigmatic figure because he has historically largely been what I would say is pseudo-libertarian, but when a pseudo-libertarian builds a platform like Palantir, which is somebody that used to be in the game, like that's a very powerful tool. Um, back to back out a little bit, back to the AI piece in warfare. I mean, it is super effective in scale with regard to, I would say, rapid target generation, which has its place in asymmetric warfare, but it also, for instance, in fighter aircraft, like there's been a lot of anecdotal conversations about the fact that some of the best fighter pilots in a simulation, none of them are able to beat AI. It's like chess. It's the same problem as chess. The best chess players right now aren't able to beat their own iPhones. So that's kind of the state of the art.
Yeah, it seems technology is kind of at the heart of so much that's going on right now. As I'm sure you know, Mike Waltz ended up having to step down, and that was all because of Signalgate, because he inadvertently, I don't know if it was inadvertently or not, but he led on a reporter into a private conversation about plans to bomb or to attack the Houthis. And they played it down, and I think that they waited to let him go, and they have given him another position of power. But a lot of people were questioning whether or not Signal should be used. And the thing is, with the United States, well, with all governments, they rarely create their own technology, so they generally use technology from the private sector. But it is supposed to be encrypted. Signal is supposed to be encrypted, and it also it erases, I believe, afterwards. So it's not a permanent thing. But that's kind of like Snapchat. If you take a screenshot of it, then it doesn't really matter. That can last forever. But yeah, what are your thoughts about that? Go ahead.
Well, a question I would have for Amir, particularly from the technical side, as the less technical guy, is, Signal off the shelf. I use it, but like I certainly don't. I certainly don't expect state actors not to be able to overcome it. The question is Signal offering other variants for government machines, and do you know if that's the case or not?
So recently, there's been this discussion about the fighter jets, which the Europeans, they now have this existential question due to the Ukraine stuff that's happening, and they're like, can we really trust these fighter jets? And when I see in the media that people are talking about that they might have a kill switch, it's kind of it's a little bit cringe, because it's kind of like, back in the day when the internet first started coming about, and we were just like young teenagers, and you're watching some old boomer politician, and he's talking about if there's the governments need to intervene, because if there's too much in the pipes, they will get blocked, and it's like, well, the internet is not pipes. And it's kind of like this, the way the discourse is going around these jets. But it's not completely wrong when they talk about a kill switch, which is not, that the US itself has put like a kill switch that is, they will deliberately invoke at some point to switch it off, which is what we're talking about now with Signal, that you're using Signal and they have a backdoor and they can access it. It's more that in a warfare situation, as logistics is a huge part of that. And these jets, they're not like just mechanical jets. You climb inside and you fly around. As you said, there's a huge amount of automation that's going on now. Like they're a very advanced system with millions of lines of code, really complex. I think they said it's something like 6 or 10 million lines of code, which is, I think the Linux kernel, which is which is the operating system that powered the internet, is maybe 2 million lines of code, just for some comparison. So these are really advanced tech with huge amount that goes into it. And every day, the software gets updates of, the radar systems and all of that info that it needs in a theater to be up to date to perform correctly. When they designed it, the US, they just designed it with, we're the ones that control the servers, we're the ones that roll out the updates. And, when the Europeans, when they bought that jets, they were just like, oh, we're just buying jets. The Americans are our friends, which is crazy if you think about it, to be a sovereign nation and to buy a weapons system that you don't even control from another country. So, when we talk about these things, we talk about, threat models. So Signal, if you are, if you're just trying to chat with someone and, you don't want your neighbor to see you, and is your grandmother, somebody not of much interest, then, Signal probably, I say, does its job. And it has, people auditing the cryptography. So you can be sure the cryptography is done well. But if, for example, now you're a government and you're the US government and, you're worried about, I don't know, Turkey, some state which doesn't control Signal, then again, I'd say Signal is probably safe,
What's your take on what happened with the, I think his name was Goldberg, with the reporter? Do you think that it was an accident, or do you think that he was actually
Yeah,
added to the
probably.
conversation? You think it was an accident?
Oh, I don't know. Maybe they were trying to leak something, but it was very insightful reading the chat. But yeah, I was just there's a bunch of things with Signal. I don't fully trust it. For example, now in Europe, people are being, arrested for protesting, government policies, immigration, etc. Signal, they're very, like that woman Meredith, she's very connected to the neoliberal deep state apparatus. She used to work at Google. I wouldn't be surprised if she has links with, some of the liberal intelligence apparatus. They're sending lobbyists. They go to the Davos. They go to Davos in Switzerland. So they're very much part of that network of people. So they can, through their logistical network, in the same way that the US controls the logistical network for these jets, they control the software that gets rolled out on your phone. They control the updates that happen. They also have access to the metadata of the chats, who you're talking with. They can see that data. So, when you use a piece of technology, it's not just like, you're using the technology. Does the technology work well? It's also who is running that technology. Do you trust their agenda? What's their interests? And so in Signal, I don't think they're completely aligned with preservation of speech necessarily. And, if a government does pressure them, then they have the capability. The only protection you have is peer-to-peer anonymous software that you control, that you run on your computer, that you have downloaded and compiled yourself. And Signal is not that model. Signal, when you download the app, you know, you're not allowed to modify it. You're not allowed to run customized versions. As there was a guy this week, I think is Matt Walsh,
Mhm.
the guy who was fired. He was using a modified version of Signal. You know,
Yeah.
Signal, if they catch you doing that, they block it. So, you know,
So my question was, did Signal allow for modified versions for DoD, machines, either SIPR or NIPR? And I don't know the answer to that. So because
I
when
don't
we
think they
said,
do. They block it if they find out.
okay, because when we say Signal, from a civilian side and from the news, we think, well, they were using what I use on my laptop, but it might not have been the case. That said, the way that it was handled, I wasn't particularly pleased with. I mean, the information that was divulged was super time sensitive and not target specific. So in terms of compromise or blowback, I wasn't really that concerned about F-18s are going to launch in 30
Oh,
minutes
I was talking about
somewhere.
another guy. There's
Oh,
two guys.
not Mike Waltz or Mike, yeah,
Waltz, I
Mike
think.
Waltz.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
No, but there was a guy, I think it was like today or yesterday, he was like fired and he was using a modified version of Signal by the Israeli, I don't know if it's the air intelligence or what, but it just logs your conversations. But you know, I had my own modified version of Signal that was doing exactly that.
Mhm.
So you know, it's not hard to do. So,
Yeah, it begs the question also, in terms of intelligence and protecting information for governments, which is not really my concern, but one would think that for their own sake, they would, rather than outsource, they would bring in a bunch of techs and create their own version of Signal that only was used by the government. But
Yep.
it doesn't seem like, of course, unfortunately, with most things that are implemented by the government, it probably wouldn't work as well as the Signal that's already
Right.
in
Well,
existence.
but in that case, Joe, like when that conversation was happening, I would suspect the political dynamic that was playing out was JD Vance was in the conversation. A
Mhm.
lot of guys that knew, hey, this conversation needs to go high side, but because the VP's on, I'm not going to say anything because like the VP's on, and if he likes this, then we're fine, which is a weakness of, I would say, leadership leading up. Somebody in that conversation should have said, "Sir, we need to take this high side." Like that was the right answer, and nobody did it. I wanted to see Trump weigh in and say, "Hey, this was a small error, but it will never happen again, and some people are going to pay the man for it." And it looks like Mike Waltz paid the man. Somebody had to pay the man for it. So, if that was Waltz's head, fair enough. But I want to see that accountability, because we haven't had accountability for 4 years. If our guy gets in who promises accountability, I want to start seeing it.
Yeah, yeah, we can't be hypocritical, which of course is ridiculous because the government is hypocritical all the time, but we try not to be. But yeah, in terms of technology, there have been problems with companies that we've contracted with regularly, like Boeing has had major problems over the past year. In fact, Elon Musk ended up being the one to provide the ship to go up and bring down those two astronauts who have been stuck there for 9 months, right? 8 or 9 months,
Mm-hmm.
when they were only
Yep.
supposed to be there for like an 8-day mission. It was like Gilligan's Island or something, a 3-hour tour. But yeah, that Boeing has had all kinds of problems with their private aircraft as well. Are they the ones that make these jets with the complicated systems as well, or is that Northrop Grumman or one of the others?
They're all doing it, and I mean, I don't know to what extent the timing wasn't political. I think Elon offered early in the Biden administration, and they held off. So if that was a political decision, that kind of sucks, for the two astronauts for sure. But yeah, in terms of the defense contractors, they're all integrating these systems into their aircraft. I recently did a study with one of the warfighting labs with regard to the technology over the next 10 years. and AI ML is right in the middle of it, along with quantum and various other technologies that are going to definitely change the face of ground warfare, to be sure. But when we think about war, we had this conversation last time with Amir and I talking about, what is war now, and we always think about the front lines, but like signal is a part of modern warfare with regard to messaging, with regard to, what is warfare now, and it's not just kinetic, it's information, it's deception, it's the whole thing. And just like we talked
Economic.
about those overlapping interests that come together to make this one thing, that's what warfare has become as well. It's war is everything.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, in terms of warfare, going back even to World War II, we had the Navajo code talkers. There was always ways that they tried to encrypt things. It was even a thing that kids were into, where they would have like decoder rings that were sold through like Ovaltine because they wanted to pretend to be spies and decode things. So we've always tried to.
Enigma, Enigma
Yeah.
with what's his name? The father of the Alan Turing.
Yeah.
Huge deal.
Yeah, yeah. So we've always tried to have a way to communicate with each other without the enemy knowing. Now, Amir, in terms of Syria, I've seen a few updates, but not a lot. But I saw that they just had another execution of a bunch of Alawites. Do you know anything about that? And do you have any updates yourself?
No, I haven't followed since we last talked. What happened?
It seems to be just more of the same. It's weird how, these things capture the news cycles and we hear about them, and then it's almost like they get frozen in time. The negotiations for Ukraine, what's happening in Gaza. Um, it's it's almost like it's not much has changed since the last time we talked, but I can't really tell.
Well,
I
that
mean, I think with Syria, what the Kurds want to do, because before there was this talk where they were like, "Oh no, we're going to integrate with Syria," but just from talking with people there, it seems all their strategy is just buy time. They just always just buy time, and they're very good because the other Kurds, which are the ones in Iraq, they're a lot more nationalist. And a few years ago, what they did was they declared their independence, and obviously that enraged the Iraqis, which Arabs, they're very there's very much this thing in like the Arab culture about shame and honor. So if you insult someone's dignity, it's almost like you challenge it. You're challenging them to fight, even if it's not rational. You're going to inflame them, because these cultures, then you know, um, I could say this also about Ukraine and Russia, which you know, we look at things sometimes in the lens of like people acting rationally or whatever, and then when the Kurds in Iraq, they announced that their independence, then Iraq invaded them and they lost over half their territory. Whereas the Syrian Kurds, they've actually had a very weak hand from the very beginning. Yet, many times, whether it was Kobani, whether it's 2019 when Trump said he'd leave, this time when, Al Qaeda came about, even in the very beginning when the Syrian government collapsed and they were up against, pre ISIS, Al Qaeda. Each one of those times, a lot of people are like, this is it. They're not, there's no way they can overcome this. But they've been very good at, diplomacy, at building bridges, at balancing powers, which is in this era, which is an era of multipolarity. New new powers and new movements are going to establish themselves are the ones that are going to do that, are the ones that are able to balance powers. And this is what happened, for example, with Yugoslavia, where it was very good at balancing between the Soviet Union and US. And I think this is like also was leading the US now in its Ukraine policy. I don't think it's people are like, oh, the US, they're trying to make this peace with Russia. I think the US's main concern is China. There's this
Yes.
old clip from Trump where he says, he talks about how, if you're up against an adversary, a formidable adversary like China, you don't want to push, Russia to be their friend. You want to win Russia over to your side. And when he came into power in 2016, actually Kissinger actually came to Trump, which Kissinger has been the architect of like a lot of US foreign policy. And he said to Trump, he was like, oh, you want to make friends with Russia. So I feel like that's kind of, what's leading the US now in that. And that's why they're kind of rolling back US aid. They're kind of signaling to other powers that, okay, the US is going to, cede, this globalist, color revolution, soft power. And in return, and they're trying to kind of, court Russia to kind of go against China with them. Because Russia and China, they geographically, they're not, even in the time of communism, which is just so strange to read about the Sino-Soviet split, where you would think that they'd be friends, but they hated each other so much that China allied with the US against Russia, which is so crazy. But there's this, the Mongolian mountain range that overlooks China. It's like almost existential. But in this case, I think it's too far gone for the US. They're making all these concessions in Ukraine to court Russia. They're like, oh, we give you everything. Like the US put literally 1 week, they blocked the aid to Ukraine. And that was devastating. Ukraine lost the Kursk region. So I just don't think, what Trump's doing is going to work. So, it's going to force America, the US, into this nativist position because they're very vulnerable on this Western flank. There's this island chain, I think it's called the second chain, which is how Japan used to project power, that the US now has around China. And you were talking about AI and stuff. They're trying to build this like networked system throughout the South China Sea that is able to respond quickly to emerging threats by China and respond to that. So this is kind of like the environment that we live in, where power is fracturing, and there's a lot of competition that's emerging. So so I think a lot of stuff in Syria, like Syria, there's a joke that people used to say, which was like, I can't remember what they said. It was something like, basically the joke was that like everyone was there, even like the Sri Lankan government, it's like everyone's got an interest in Syria. So, like there's a lot, like as well, whenever you see governments say things, you should just ignore it because, Turkey, for example, they constantly announce that they're going to invade Syria. But the reason they do that is because, they want to distract their population from a failing economy. There's election season coming up, whatever. Usually if you're going to attack someone, you don't announce it in a big headline beforehand. It's like when you see a two guys facing off, and one of them is speaking really loudly, and he wants to be pulled away by his friends.
Yeah,
Hold me
exactly.
back, hold me
When someone's
back.
serious, they go straight for the throat. So a lot of what you see going on in Syria, you see big headlines, big announcements. You really have to look at the actions, because it's the fog of war is there constantly. It's like people trying to buy time, people trying to, as you said, war is informational. It's not solely military these days. It's economic as well. This is something I've been thinking about recently, which is how vulnerable our economies are to economic attack. And it's something that has not really been leveraged so much. And I think with the emergence of, like these new economic networks that will happen increasingly more in the future that are outside the centralized control, we're going to see a lot more. Like right now, I think North Korea is one of the main actors that has been responsible for a lot of kind of, economic kind of cyber warfare on the internet, mainly in cryptocurrency, doing things like, ransom, you know, theft, etc. But I think that aspect of war is a very powerful one. Like the way that we live today, the societies we live in, they're very complex, they're very multi-chained, and because of that, they're non-robust. Especially we're in this world where there's increased competition amongst states, and usually robustness, when you engineer robustness, that comes at the expense of growth.
Mhm.
It's like, the balance between expansion and consolidation.
Mhm.
And right now we're not in this phase where states can afford to consolidate, so they're over leveraging, and when you over leverage, you become vulnerable to collapse.
Yeah. And speaking of China and Russia, everybody was talking about BRICS for a long time. I wonder where they stand. It seems India has kind of gotten out of it, or they've made some kind of pledge to Trump that they're getting out of BRICS. Is that kind of falling apart, or do you think it's going to move forward eventually in one way or another? Any of you?
I mean, I think Trump's primary objective initially is short-term disruption of BRICS to reestablish, American dominance and dollar, preserving the petrodollar, et cetera. To Amir's point with regard to emerging economic threat, there are a lot of genies out there that are still in the bottle, and I think some of these follow nuclear game theory with regard to, the fact that we have all these nuclear armaments. We haven't had a major nuclear engagement the entire time. A lot of that is due to the fact that nobody wants to be the one, post Nagasaki, to pull that genie out of the bottle. And so I think there is some optimism there with regard to the capabilities are there, but who wants to be the one to squeeze the toothpaste out of the tube, so to speak. So there's some natural barriers there to hopefully the unthinkable, or the worst. Because I think once you kick off some of these economic large scale, we don't know what the secondary and tertiary consequences are globally, and who wants to be the one to crash the world.
Yeah, and I mean, we had the Great Depression in the 30s, which led to a lot of safety nets, but the safety nets are still all based on the federal government having, and the United States having the money to be able to do that. And I can tell you, living in California, we're broke. We're in the red. We had a surplus, and not too long ago, but COVID kind of threw that out the window, and now we're begging money from the federal government while we're suing them
Right.
at the
Well,
same time.
there's an intermediate step there. We built the lockbox, right? The lockbox was supposed to be there, and we're paying into Social Security. And had we been putting our Social Security payments into the market, the returns would have been exponential by comparison. So there's ripoff number one. Number two is under President Johnson, they raided the lockbox and turned it into a slush fund, and now it's become a true Ponzi scheme in which the younger generation is footing the bill for the seniors' pensions. So that's an unsustainable model, but it really falls back to that intermediary step of raiding the lockbox. And so that's a historic precedent that you can't trust the state to abide by the terms of the initial agreement, with regard to New Deal or Square Deal or Great Society or whatever it is. You're inevitably going to grow the state regardless of what you want the outcome to be.
Yeah, it's a Ponzi scheme. Basically, it's the same in Europe. A lot of people's pensions are going down, and they're forcing them to work longer. And across Europe, there's been, and just like what happened in the United States as well, there's been a mass migration of immigrants from all over the world, and many of them are not working at all. I read some study about how in many cities in the UK, the majority of Muslim women don't work and receive aid from the federal or from the government of the UK. That's unsustainable because there's a massive amount of them, and there's more coming. So, and I wonder if there was some kind of a plan to crash economies in these different countries just to
Ploward
create
pivot
chaos.
modified. Yeah. So the Ploward pivot was a strategy, devised in the late 60s. Richard Cloward, Francis Fox Piven, and they were, social workers slash, Marxists. And the plan was to overwhelm the welfare and immigration rolls in the U.S. to crash the U.S. economy so that they could usher in the utopia, right? Like that was the plan. And, that strategy has morphed and adapted and moved. And so like, that's certainly a strategy in Europe with regard to overwhelming the roles, because they already have the infrastructure of a robust welfare system. Whereas, so for instance, like the average French salary and the average American salary, Americans make 50% more in their average salary than the French do, but the French boast free healthcare and free services. The question is, what is the return on that loss of individual revenue? So they already have the infrastructure to be exploited. I would say more so than the American infrastructure, but the American infrastructure is working hard to catch up.
Yeah, and
Europeans. Oh,
yeah.
sorry.
No, go for it. Go
No,
for
I
it.
was going to say Europeans are just delusional because, when the welfare system was first invented in, post World War II, the US was a protector, of Europe, and at the time, 2/3 of the population was under 30.
Mhm.
Now it's like less than a third. So the welfare system isn't even designed, it was designed for a completely different, world, a completely different time. And not only that, its scope has just increased massively. Also, Europeans, they are 8% of the world's population, but over 50% of the world's welfare spending. And they now want to arm, and they want to go to war with Russia. And people are like, on the paper, when you see the numbers, you're like, okay, Europe, maybe they can do this. It seems logical, but we're talking about an economic bloc where everything is decided by committee. Each state cannot agree on anything. So any estimate, it's like, we were talking before the call about, project management and Zeno's paradox,
Mhm.
which is like you write something on paper and you're like, okay, this takes 2 weeks and this takes 1 week. And, maybe that's correct, right? But there's always things that happen that you don't predict. And, Europeans are just accustomed to a completely different way of life. that they have all grown up around welfare, and that's because the budget, the money that would be normally given to military, is instead given to social welfare spending. The only way that Europe can, go into this war economy that they want to create to replace the US from exiting, especially, let's say Trump is just one term and, he doesn't come back. The damage has been done. Like, people have recognized now, we were talking about the kill switch, the so-called kill switch on the jets. People are like, okay, we Europeans can't afford to be reliable on an outside power, which is what they always should have been done from the very beginning. But not only that, at the same time that they're trying to build such a massive military industrial complex, they want to open up a front against Russia. So it's like, it's already a tenuous plan by itself. And the immigration, part of it is ideological, part of it is economic. You have to realize that this liberal ideology is primarily an economic ideology. It's the rules-based international order. It's a super system, mechanical super system, where there's such things as rights, and people are pieces in that machine. It's like, as you said, with this communist death instinct, essentially, where power no longer exists. It still exists in the form of a state and the bureaucracy, but agency and evolution and those kind of things cease to exist. There is no concept of sovereignty or autonomy, etc. But the other ideological side of that, one of the architects, Karl Popper, who's very influential, he actually says that he talks about bringing in radically different cultures, like a radical Muslim and a Christian, and he says that conflict between those two breaks down any old tradition that exists. It causes those, and that's kind of like how they. I don't know if you've ever heard of this, where apparently in the US there is a kind of conflict between the Federal Reserve and the Trump administration, where the Federal Reserve is trying to engineer a political crisis. This is kind of what happened in Japan, how the Japanese system, which was very successful economically and was the legacy of the fascist post-World War II system, how the neoliberal globalists infiltrated that and seized control of the economic system in Japan from the cartels, who basically they guaranteed employment, and they basically opened that up to multinational infiltration, was by engineering an economic crisis. Yep. If you look at what happened in Japan, there was a period in the mid-90s where everybody goes, oh, there was so much money around, everybody was getting taxis all the time, etc. It was because they were deliberately the machine, like, pumping it to its very extreme until it exploded, and we got this decade of stagnation. So there is an aspect of that in terms of like these migration policies, where they're deliberately meant to break some stranglehold of the last, because the European Western culture, people don't realize the reason why. The Middle East, like Turkey and so on, they had this period in the beginning of the last century where they became extremely secular and nationalist. And that was because, after the decaying Ottoman Empire, people in the Middle East kind of looked to the West and they said, we have to copy that system. And it's obviously been like a huge disaster in the Middle East because it's led to a huge amount of ethnic, division and conflict, like in Syria and Iraq, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which cuts through, ethnic boundaries. The Kurds themselves, if you look at the map, it's like a crosshair that deliberately is on the center of them. And that was engineered deliberately by the British and the French to eliminate them as a people. And successive states that have had to come have had to maintain their power. And this is what happened in Syria, for these dictatorships to maintain power. They have to smash the sovereignty of the corresponding nations within society. And Europe has had this process, which has gone on for centuries. The French Revolution, after the French Revolution, there was a huge campaign against southern France, against the Occitan people, which now everybody speaks French, but not only 120 years ago, 40% of France South France used to speak Occitan.
Exactly.
That was deliberately eliminated in order to guarantee the unity of the French state.
Same in Spain with the Catalanes and with the Basques.
Same thing in Spain. And so
suddenly we're
this
back
is
to
now
Constantine,
what the
right?
European liberal project they're trying to do with this immigration. They're deliberate. It's like, empires have done this throughout history. The very first empire in history, the Assyrian Empire is a brutal, militaristic empire. And the way that they cemented power was deporting people all across everywhere. The Soviets did it. Loads of people have done it, so.
Well, so you mentioned Popper. But Popper is a key influence on Soros. And so a lot of Soros's operations with regard to moving mass populations around is that kind of dialectic idea of thesis, antithesis clashing and forming this new synthesis to ultimately destroy what would you call it, the post-war order. So yeah, I'm in agreement on that with regard to your take on Popper and what empires have always done. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think also with religion, basically, of course, the United States has always been a country of immigrants, and what the Spanish and even the English did initially when they conquered the country is they forced the Native Americans even to convert to Christianity. But the newer immigrants that are coming into Europe and coming to the United States are Muslim, and that's not a culture that's open to integrating into the common society and becoming a part of it. Either they become secular, which some of them do and do really well, or they hold on to their beliefs and they separate themselves from the rest of society. And I mean, that was often an issue, I think, even with the Jewish population throughout the world, is that they could never 100% integrate into society because they couldn't marry outside of the faith unless the person converted, and they also didn't eat things that the local population ate, like pork and shellfish, etc. So
garden model.
Yeah, so it's a tricky thing, but the population is like the Jews were not a traditionally violent population, but a lot of these Middle Eastern people are. And so it is, I don't know, it's interesting. It's hard to talk about this without being accused of being a racist in one way or another. I saw some statistic recently that the mayors of all the major cities of the UK are now Muslim. And I know in Spain, they're actually teaching in Arabic in some schools, in Valencia specifically. And there are Muslim classes throughout. So there's even a push. Of course, there's a traditional belief by a lot of Muslims that Spain should go back to being Muslim because they were Al-Andalus for. I
actually met a member of ISIS in one of these refugee places. Like I went to, there was like an open dinner or something. And I was just talking with a friend of mine about Syria, and some guy with pink hair, he goes, "Oh, you're in Syria? Oh, Mohammed or Ahmed or was in Syria. He was with the anarchists in Syria, and he started calling over this guy. And I went, I went with the anarchists, and I asked him where is he from, and he said Hasaka, which I know was an ISIS place. And I was like, so you with the YPG? And he was like, no, I hate the YPG. And then at some point he started, he started going on like, oh, my brother died for what? For jihad, like that. And I was, at that point, I knew he was an ISIS guy. It's just obvious to me, having been there.
Yeah.
You tell these things. And I was like, just looking for a way out. And he was like, oh, where were you and stuff? And I just didn't want to answer. But I was like, that's
Make
just
yourself
crazy.
a target.
Yeah, because I don't know if ISIS people are crazy. So, but people don't know these things, and is one thing if you were kind of going, which I actually had a developer, a skilled developer that I wanted to bring because I have a company and I have a project, and I wanted to bring him to work on my project. And I started to look into it, and the paperwork is just insane, and it was impossible to bring him from Syria, by the way. And I couldn't bring him to work on in my company. But in the end, he just came as a refugee. So I was like, well, what's that about? Why are people, they're just bringing them in as refugees, but you can't employ them as legit developer? Why? And like, it's not like they're going like, oh, this guy, he's a Druze, and they believe that, and this is aligned with the values of what people here believe, and we're trying to create this kind of society. No, it's not like that at all. It's just like, oh, each one of these are economic units. Yeah, and they just bring them all in. But some of these people, they're ex-ISIS. They're literally ISIS people.
Yep.
Islam. I have my critique of Islam. We can have a theological debate. I'd love to have that. I have my views, on Abrahamic faiths, etc. But some Muslims, they're very nice people. There are some aspects of their belief which make them very kind, and give them certain values. And but so these, but then there's like, we're not, there's like people that are legit like ISIS people. And, sometimes I even think there's like a bigger agenda there, because of the people in the UK that went to fight with the YPG, 20% were prosecuted for fighting against ISIS. 20% were prosecuted. And a lot more were investigated for terrorism, etc. Only 3% of ISIS people were prosecuted in the UK.
Yeah,
And
it
like,
makes
is
you
that
wonder what
malicious?
yeah,
Or
yeah,
is that just naivety?
yeah.
Because I saw as well, there was like a government program before where they were like, oh, we're doing this new thing to integrate ex-ISIS people back into society. And I was like looking at what their thing is. And it was like, oh, we give them jobs because, they need money. That's what the reason they go there, because they don't have enough
Opportunity.
money.
They don't have
Yeah, and
opportunity.
like,
That's
oh
why
yeah,
they're holding
so
orders.
Al-Shishtani, Al-Brittani, who's like a veteran of Chechen and Afghan wars, expert in Sharia law and guerrilla warfare. You're just gonna win him over with a piece of bread.
Yeah.
Like these people, some of the people that went to join ISIS, they were they were famous people, rappers, doctors, engineers, PhDs, people that had money. The classic liberal narrative is like, why would anybody leave the comfort of London? London's a perfect paradise. Why would you leave there to go to a desert, to pick up an AK and fight for an Islamic caliphate? This is something the liberal minds cannot comprehend.
Can't comprehend.
These people actually believe, they're actually ideological. And they're like, oh, we're going to go to war with Russia. Can you imagine sending like Europeans, which Europeans love war. Like they spent the entire like last millenniums constantly at war. And it's like when there's not a war, we see, like the god of Odin. It's almost like it's being summoned back. Oh, we need a good war. But I don't think people. And the thing with Odin is he's like a god, and when he's with you, everything seems great. Things are happening, but then at some point he's flaky, and he will just leave and abandon you, and you'll be all by yourself, and you'll be like, oh, and then you'll be in the shit. And Europeans, they haven't had a war in a long time. America is different, man. They've been at war continuously, like the last century.
Yeah.
Europeans
Not
like,
on
oh,
our
let's
not
go
on
to
our
war with
territory,
Russia.
thank goodness. But
And like
yeah,
Russians,
yeah.
they're crazy. They're actually nationalists. They're like literally national. They literally die for Russia. They literally take prisoners and they bomb them. They literally rape prisoners. That's what they do. Can you imagine Europeans who've never had any war? They suddenly go into war with Russia. It's like, I don't think people are like, and I saw a BBC interview, and it was a Muslim woman. She was like, oh, the Muslim cancer of England. She had no headscarf, so she was like one of these fake liberal Muslims. But they were going to her. They're going to her. Oh, they're asking about the youth that go to join ISIS, and she goes, "Oh, they're just brainwashed. Oh, they're really confused." I was like, I don't think they're confused. I think they know exactly what they're doing. They might not have my ideology or your ideology, but they have an ideology, and they're very intelligent and they're very smart. This is the thing. Like the liberal society, which has become terminal, and it's become righteous, and it looks down on everyone. It's like, oh, the Chinese, they're authoritarian. Oh, the Russians, they're baddies. Like Trump, he's a bad orange man. I'm not saying that they're the good, those other guys are good or whatever. I'm not making that value judgment, but I'm also saying that liberals, they're not righteous. They believe that they are, but
Yeah, they oversimplify everything. It's all black and white, and it is all the goodies and the baddies. And then also they
and
believe
they
in,
call everyone else.
yeah,
Like this is what happened to me. I came back from Syria fighting in the YPG, and the UK leftists, they cancelled me. They literally wrote articles saying I'm a fascist. Like, can you believe that? Like, it's just crazy. I didn't believe it. I was like, just astounding. Why do people act like that? Just
Yeah.
out of jealousy, out of like weakness and spite. And it's because those are the values on the left that are valorized.
Yeah.
And so that's why it's like tearing itself apart.
It's a very
And
shallow virtue structure.
the liberal order is really corrupt.
It acts like a mask of virtue, and there's not really a lot of substance behind it. Amir, you touched on something that I've had frustration with, which is the business sector with regard to China and with regard to cheap labor via open border. They have a mindset of, we have this responsibility in this lane, and this other stuff is not our job. And it's like, you don't realize that you're now part of a war. Like, it doesn't make sense to the average NBA from my alma mater that war is taking place in the corporate space as well. And, trade with China and a lot of our business dealings. I dealt with this as an economic development research director for my home state. We had a Republican administration, but we were split down the middle because half of them were very pro Sino, pro let's get into bed with as much Chinese business as we can, and the other half, most of which had served in the military, were like, no, man, like you don't understand the long game here, and you're playing a quarterly profit P&L statement game that, the Red Dragon is not playing that game, man. They're playing a very long, protracted game, and we need to understand that. So generalization needs to make some return in our specialized economy to understand the implications across disciplines, something like that.
yeah. Well, it's with the recent moves that Trump has done with tariffs, et cetera, and trying to bring back factories to the United States, which of course won't happen for years, but still needs to get started, needed to get started a long time ago. We've offshored so much, all of our industry, basically. We're a consumer economy that doesn't produce anything, and that needs to change. But I'm wondering, I mean, there's going to be economic instability, and there's also the risk of war. I haven't heard much lately about us possibly going to war with Iran, but that's always kind of on the back burner. I think China is more of an economic war, but there's a possibility of that ramping up as well, depending on how far we get cut off from them. I'm wondering with Iran, there's always been this talk of nukes with Iran, but does anybody know if they actually have them at this point, or will have them soon?
I think they never so the nuclear program was actually started under the Shah, and it was actually supported by the West, like the West that gave those capability. But then obviously the regime, they continued that work, and they're not friends with the West. But I don't think they ever reached the enrichment capability that's like required for nukes. Obviously, there's like that famous story of Stuxnet before in the past. But the thing about Iran is the geography, which the geography is literally a giant fortress, which is, if you look throughout its history, the way that Iran has always ruled has been through this satrapy system, where they give like a lot of they basically use guerrilla armies and networks of influence, which is basically what the Iranian government does today. And that's because maintaining supply lines out of Iran is very difficult, but it's also a double-edged sword, because while it's difficult for them to project power outside of that zone, it's also a highly defensive kind of territory. So you can guarantee that all of those mountains that they have is just going to be filled with tunnels, and they've had a long time to do that. I think any invasion of Iran would just be insane, will be suicidal. So I don't think the US is going to do that. Also, the thing with Iran, though, is they did bet massively on Syria. So when last time I was in Iran was a very long time ago, but even back then, people were super agitated. They were like, oh, why is our money going to Palestinians when we're starving? People are like, oh, we like America, etc. So it's a population that's very sympathetic. But now, more recently, the situation with fuel and with everything in general has become a lot harsher. People are like really under a lot of pressure. The thing is, as well, I remember talking with Iranians, young Iranians, and they would say to me that they hate their government, but if the US would invade them, they would fight with the government against any foreign invader. So you've got a population which is very sympathetic to the West, and aligned with Western objectives. So I don't think the US will go for some full invasion, as people are implying. As we said, like, governments talk a big game, and when they talk a big game, often it doesn't really mean anything. I think instead, the way that they're going to try and influence Iran is added more pressure, more kind of color revolution kind of style, targeted bombings to degrade their capabilities. Also, Iran is self-sufficient. They have the oil. They're trading a lot with China as well, and Russia. So yeah, I don't. The thing as well is, we were just talking about the you know the way people are running these economies, like in the UK and so on. I actually saw a while back that Larry Fink of BlackRock, he went to the UK government and he said to them, he was like, oh, Brexit, because of Brexit, we've had a lot of labor shortages. And the government I read this in a business magazine, so it's not a political thing, it's like in a business thing. And the government replied, oh, yeah, Mr. Larry Fink, okay, we're about to start a new round of accelerated immigration. So I was just very shocked to read that, because, BlackRock have that much power over the UK government, and the UK government now, with everything that's happening, which is crazy stuff in where people, like, there's mad stuff. The UK is in a real social meltdown. It's not just immigrants, it's everything. Like any vestige of like old local culture has long been gone by Westminster, by the power of Westminster. There is now like a lot of attitude amongst people of like, oh, colonialism was actually a good thing. And I understand where that sentiment is coming from, which is that, people, they want to feel a sense of pride or a sense of dignity. The West is in a kind of terminal state, like the Roman Empire. Before when a republic transitioned to an empire, it was already, going through these motions of, an overextended military, debasement of the currency, obsession with obstacle and entertainment. A lot of the same things which we see today, which is no mistake, because our political system is modeled off of the Roman system. So they see bad news everywhere. They hear about bad things, and they want to reclaim some sense of pride. So they're like, oh, colonialism, that was a good thing. But the thing is imperialism as a system, it benefits only a small group of elites, because what we see now, the initial phases of that was the periphery, the integration of the periphery with the core. And how does an imperial system maintain its domination or power over its extended network? Has to centralize the political system. That comes at the expense of all people's sovereignty, which is now what's basically happening.
Yep.
The thing is that the business people, they see things under the system of law, under, like when you acquire a company, you acquire those employees, you now can give the orders or commands to your employees. But actually when we're talking about these social systems, we're talking about, migrations of populations within them. We're not talking about, Twitter in 2017 or 2018. We're talking about something like a farm in Romania where, after the collapse of communism, and you go there and some guy shows you a piece of paper and he goes, oh, if you give me this money, I'll give you this farm. And,
right,
it's all really dodgy, and you sign the papers, and, you're like, you go into the room and there's like a room full of old tractors, and you're not even sure what you want to do at the place. And, there's some dudes walking around and they think they run the show, but you're like, oh, but I have the papers that show that I'm the owner. But they're like the ones, they're like strong geezers walking around. So, that's kind of what we're dealing with. And,
I agree. Basically, colonialism was kind of like the opposite of what we're doing now, or the inverse of it, because basically at that point, Europe was the consumer, and they were taking goods from the Americas and from Africa. and bringing them back to their countries. But a lot of them, depending on the country, but a lot of them didn't really plan on creating these new countries. They just wanted to pull what they could out of these territories and then move on. But of course, for the elites, I want to thank you guys so much. We're coming up on about an hour and 15 minutes. So I figured this might be a good time to wrap it up, but I definitely want to come back maybe in the fall and talk some more. I have a feeling there'll be a lot more going on over the summer, and it's going to be it's been an interesting year. It's hard to keep track of everything, right here in California. We've had fires, we've had the death of Hollywood. Everything is shifting, and it's doing it at a rapid pace. So it's hard to keep track of everything. But at the same time, like I said, the conflicts overseas seem to be inching along, even though there are massive deaths going on. The steps towards peace are kind of baby steps, as they say.
Yeah, everything changes, but nothing really changes. And we've explored the flakiness of Zeus.
Absolutely. Well, Brooks, where can people find you on the internet? And
you can find me on X Crenshaw Actual. Give me a follow, and then on Substack, I write for the Daedalus thread, which is Daedalus as in Daedalus Icarus and Daedalus Daedalus. I do a lot of commentary there around inherited story and culture. So take a look. Perfect.
And Amir, where can folks find you?
Also Twitter, probably through your page. Like I'm sure they just click.
Yeah, sounds good. Well, thanks again. And to all our listeners, thank you. And until next time.